This is Chapter 1, The Human Body, an Orientation to Anatomy and Physiology. Anatomy and physiology is the study of the structure and the function of the body. So when we look at anatomy, we're looking at the structure of different body parts and their relationship to one another. When we study physiology, we're looking at the function of those body parts. So how do they work to carry out these life-sustaining activities? Some subdivisions of anatomy include gross or macroscopic anatomy, which is just the study of large visible structures, things you can see with the naked eye. Regional anatomy would look at the structures in a particular area of the body, so maybe cranial anatomy. System anatomy looks at one particular organ system, so the cardiovascular system or the nervous system. Microscopic anatomy, we're looking at structures that are too small to be seen by the naked eye and would require the use of a microscope. So cytology is the microscopic study of cells, and histology is the microscopic study of tissues. Subdivisions of physiology are based on different organ systems. So throughout the course, we'll look at different organ systems and their physiology. So the renal system or the urinary system, the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system. So when we look at these organ systems, we often focus on the cellular and molecular levels of the body and the tissues. So it looks at how the body's abilities are dependent on these chemical reactions within individual cells. So in order to study physiology, you have to understand the basic physical principles as well as some basic chemical principles. So physical principles, things like electric currents, pressure, movement, lever systems, we'll talk about throughout the semester. And then chemical principles, so things like pH, diffusion, and osmosis. So anatomy and physiology are always lumped together because they are inseparable. The function is always going to reflect the structure. So the shape of something dictates what it's able to do. So this is known as the principle of complementarity of structure and function. So just saying that the function of a cell or body part is dependent on its shape. So some examples, cellular examples, sperm cells are specialized to be highly mobile. So they have the flagella, so their shape allows them to swim and meet the egg for fertilization. Red blood cells are shaped to make them highly efficient at oxygen transport. And cardiac muscle cells are specialized for contraction and sending those electrical signals between the cells. Another example looking at the forelimbs of some different type mammals. So humans, cats, whales, and bats. So we all have the same basic bone structure. So we have a humerus, a radius, an ulna, carpals and metacarpals, but they're structured and shaped differently because they have different functions. So humans, our forearms and hands are adapted for grasping and reaching, whereas whales, their structure is for the function of swimming. And bats, so their structure reflects a flight function. So the human body is very organized from the smallest, most basic chemical level all the way to the entire organism level. So kind of at the bottom of the hierarchy, we have the chemical level. So it's composed of atoms and molecules. So different atoms and chemicals will combine and join together to form molecules. So then these molecules will combine and work together to form cells. So cells are made up of different molecules. So then different cells can work together to compose a tissue. Tissues are composed of different or similar types of cells with a common function, shared common function. So then we can have different tissues working together to form organs. So organs are made up of different types of tissues. So this example is a blood vessel. So we have some epithelial tissue lining the inside cavity, some smooth muscle tissue, and then some connective tissue. So then different organs can work together for shared common functions and compose organ systems. So different organs working closely together for that shared purpose or function. So like the cardiovascular system, right, or the respiratory system. And then finally, when you have multiple organ systems cooperating together, um, you reach the organismal level, right? So we are made up of many different organ systems. So all living things have the same basic necessary life functions, right, to maintain life and survive. So even the simplest single-celled organisms like protists, amoebas, bacteria, all in one way or another have to meet all of these criteria to maintain their life. So one necessary life function is maintaining boundaries. So we have to separate the inside internal environment from the outside world. So examples of this would be the plasma membrane of the cell. So it isolates the internal cell contents from the external environment, just like our skin. So our skin helps maintain that boundary between our insides and the outside world. Movement is another necessary life function, so we have to be able to move our body parts or substances like blood and food for digestion throughout our body. Responsiveness is the ability to sense and respond to stimuli, so we have to be aware of what's around us, what's in our environment, as well as respond to internal stimuli. Digestion is breaking down and absorption of nutrients. So you eat food, you break it down, and you harvest and absorb those nutrients from the food. Metabolism is the sum of all of the chemical reactions that happen in a cell. So we'll talk more about this later, but you have some type of metabolism that works to break down molecules, so things like digestion activities, and then you have some metabolism for building up new molecules. So we take the protein that we digested from our lunch and we use that to metabolize and make new muscle fibers and our own proteins. Another necessary life function is excretion. So through our metabolism, all of these chemical reactions, there are some waste products that are going to be produced along the way. So we need to remove these waste so they don't build up and cause problems. Reproduction. So all living things are capable of reproducing. So it's not only the production of offspring, but also consists of cell division. So when you grow, your cells are dividing and making new cells, right? So that is also a type of reproduction. And then finally, growth. So just increase in size of certain body parts or tissues. Humans are multicellular, so we're composed of trillions of cells, all working together individually to keep us alive. So our organ systems are designed to service specific cells and tissues. So all of our cells ultimately are going to depend on their organ systems to meet their survival needs, right? To get the nutrients, to remove waste products, to get oxygen. So there's a total of 11 organ systems that we'll look at throughout this semester and next semester that all work together to maintain our life. So this example is showing kind of this interconnectedness between the various organ systems. So this represents the skin of the integumentary system. So it's protecting the body as a whole from whatever is on the outside environment. The digestive system is where we're going to take in nutrients and break them down, as well as eliminate any waste products in the feces. So the digestive system, as it's breaking down your food, you're going to absorb the nutrients from that food into the bloodstream. Right? So now it's within the cardiovascular system. So the heart is going to pump the blood all throughout the body to the tissues and deliver oxygen and dispose of waste. So also, kind of hand in hand with the cardiovascular system is the respiratory system. So we have to breathe oxygen that's going to have that gas exchange occur with the cardiovascular system. Right? So we're going to get fresh oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide waste. Also, the cardiovascular system, the blood in the body is going to be filtered by the kidneys and the urinary system. So this helps with that excretion function by eliminating those waste products and any excess ions in fluid. So the first major organ system that we'll look at is the integumentary system. So this It's comprised of the skin, the hair, and the nails. Right? So it's going to form those external body coverings and protect our deeper tissues from injury. Some other functions of the skin and integumentary system include synthesizing vitamin D, as well as housing our cutaneous uh, receptors, so our touch, pain, pressure receptors in the skin, and our sweat and oil glands. The skeletal system provides support for our body organs and overall framework for the body's muscles to allow our body to move. Another function of the skeletal system is blood cell formation. So all blood cells originate in the bone marrow of the skeletal system. Bones also function for mineral storage. So a lot of calcium and phosphorus are stored within the bone tissue. The muscular system allows manipulation of the environment, locomotion, and facial expression. So it allows us to move various parts of our body in different directions. Also helps to maintain posture. And another function of the muscular system is heat production. So muscles have very high metabolic rates, so they put off a lot of heat. So if you exercise and you get hot and sweaty, right, you've experienced this heat production. The nervous system is the overall control center of the body, so it's going to monitor and respond to internal and external changes. So it does this by activating muscles or glands, they're called effector organs. The endocrine system is another major controlling system in the body of various body processes. So it regulates processes like growth, reproduction, and metabolism. It secretes hormones, things like insulin, testosterone, thyroid hormone. The cardiovascular system is composed of the heart and blood vessels, so it's the body's transport system. So we're going to transport blood throughout the body. It's going to carry fresh oxygen and then pick up carbon dioxide from the tissues and other nutrients and waste. The lymphatic system and the immune system are two different organ systems, but they're typically kind of lumped in together because they do work so closely together. So the lymphatic system works to pick up any leaked fluid from the circulatory system within the tissues and return it back to the circulation. But before it does that, it's going to filter and clean the fluid. So it's also going to contain some of our immune system cells that are going to help protect us against foreign invaders, things like pathogens, bacteria, and viruses. The respiratory system is going to keep our blood constantly supplied with that oxygen that our tissues need. It's also going to be how we excrete or remove carbon dioxide waste from the body when we exhale. So the gas exchange with the blood is going to take place within the air sacs in the lungs. So there are lots and lots of blood vessels and capillaries within the air sacs in the lungs. So when you inhale the oxygen, it makes contact with those capillaries and then is transferred to the cardiovascular system. The digestive system is how we break down food into absorbable or usable units that the blood that can enter the blood for distribution to body cells. So basically, the digestive system breaks down the food until the molecules are small enough to pass through the intestinal lining into the bloodstream. Anything that is not digestible will just be eliminated as feces. The urinary system is composed of the kidneys, the ureters, and the bladder and the urethra. So its function is to eliminate nitrogenous waste from the body. So it filters the blood and removes a lot of those nitrogenous waste, things like ammonia, urea. It also helps to regulate our water balance, electrolyte, and acid-base balance in the blood. The male reproductive system is composed of the penis, the testes, the prostate, and some other accessory ducts and glands. The overall function is, of course, production of offspring. Another function is male sex hormone production. So testosterone production is also a function of the male reproductive system. The female reproductive system is composed of the vagina, the uterus, the ovaries, and the mammary glands. The uterus is for nourishing the developing fetus and fertilization. Mammary glands would then be for milk production. The ovaries also function in the sex hormone production of estrogen in females. So looking at some basic survival needs of humans. So we need several factors for survival, and they have to be in just the right amount. So just too much or too little could be harmful. So it has to be within that Goldilocks zone. So things like nutrients, right, so that we get from our food, right, we digest and get nutrients. Oxygen that we breathe, water. Right, so our body is about 70% water, so it's very important for our metabolism, chemical reactions, as well as just keeping our cells healthy. Normal body temperature. So a lot of our chemical reactions in our cells can only occur at that normal body temperature. Um, and another one that might not be as intuitive is appropriate atmospheric pressure. So just the pressure in the atmosphere can play a role in your respiration. So the main goal of the body is to maintain homeostasis. So this is just that relatively stable internal conditions of the body despite things continuously changing outside the body. So when things are in balance, right, you're healthy, right, everything's going well. Homeostatic imbalance can lead to things like disease and other health disorders. So typically the body is pretty good at restoring the homeostasis, right, and maintaining those stable conditions. But sometimes if the system cannot restore the balance, it can even lead to death. So our homeostatic controls of the body are called feedback loops. So there's different variables in the body that have to be constantly monitored and regulated to maintain this homeostasis. So a variable is anything that can vary or anything that can change. So things like blood sugar, body temperature, blood volume, different ion concentration in the blood, chemical composition of the blood, right? All of that can vary. These variables are primarily regulated and controlled by the nervous system and the endocrine system. So the basic steps of a homeostatic feedback loop. So you have to have a receptor or a sensor, so something that's able to detect a change in the variable, something that's able to detect this imbalance that's occurring. The control center is the brain or the spinal cord that's going to integrate this incoming information. Right? So the sensors are going to send the signal to the brain, and then the brain will determine how to respond. So our response will be carried out by our effector, which is typically a muscle or a gland. Right? So the effector is going to bring about the necessary adjustment. Right? So whatever we need to do to restore that homeostasis. So again, the stimulus, right, is producing a change in our variable, right? Our receptor detects that change. So we're going to send that information to the control center. Right? So again, the brain or the spinal cord. So the control center is also going to determine the set point which a variable is maintained. So we have to have kind of a set parameter of what's acceptable. So we'll know if it's off kilter. Right? So kind of like the thermostat. So body temperature is a common homeostatic mechanism that we'll look at in just a minute. But the brain is ultimately the body's thermostat, determines what our body temperature should be. So if it goes outside of that acceptable range, then we have to respond. So we'll have our output response sent to our effector, right, which would then have an effect to return the system to homeostasis. So again, the effector is what's providing the response, right, to the original stimulus. So our response could be either a negative feedback, which would mean that we're going to reduce the stimulus. Right? So the stimulus is, say, increasing blood sugar over here. So the effector, in a negative feedback, we're going to lower the blood sugar back down. Occasionally, we can have a positive feedback where we're going to enhance the stimulus. So this would be kind of like a snowball effect. So the stimulus raises a little bit, and then we're going to raise it some more. So we're going to have that positive feedback loop and amplify the effect. Negative feedback is most commonly used in the body. So like we said, with negative feedback, we're going to essentially shut off the original stimulus. We're going to turn it off. We don't want to ramp it up. We want to turn it down. So our variable is going to change in the opposite direction of the initial change. So in this example, body temperature rises is the stimulus. So our response in a negative feedback would be the body temperature going back down. So when your body temperature rises, we have receptors that monitor the temperature in the skin and the brain. So they detect body temperatures getting a little up there. So we alert the control center, the thermoregulatory center of the hypothalamus in the brain. So the brain looks at the data, looks at the message and says, oh yeah, temperature is getting too high. We need to get it lower. So how do we do that? Well, the brain is going to tell our effectors, in this case the sweat glands, to start producing sweat. So when you sweat, the water in the sweat absorbs the excess heat, and as it evaporates off your skin, it carries the heat away with it and helps cool you down. So we'll lower body temperature back down to original homeostatic levels. We can also go the opposite direction with this. So say our stimulus is body temperatures falling, so we need to raise the body temperature. Right? So again, those same temperature sensitive receptors are going to detect this change in body temperature, alert the control center in the brain. But in this case, now our effector organs are the skeletal muscles. So the brain will tell the skeletal muscles to start shivering. Right? Remember we said muscles put off a lot of heat. So when you shiver, those muscles are giving off heat and helping to raise your body temperature back to normal. Regulation of blood glucose by insulin is another common negative feedback, but this one would be an endocrine system regulated mechanism. So another example of negative feedback, blood glucose levels. So in this case, we're dealing with an endocrine system mechanism. So we have receptors that monitor the blood sugar or the amount of glucose in the blood. The pancreas is the control center in this case. So it's going to detect or that glucose has increased. So it detects that increase in glucose and releases insulin. So insulin ultimately is going to cause the body cells or our effectors to take the glucose out of the blood and use it for their energy production. So we'll decrease the amount of glucose in the blood. Vice versa, if glucose starts to decrease, the pancreas can stop producing insulin and release another hormone. So it's going to cause the blood sugar to rise again back to normal homeostatic levels. So like we said, positive feedback would be the opposite of a negative feedback. So negative feedback, we're turning off. Whatever the stimulus is, whatever's causing the problem, we want it to do the opposite and turn it off. Positive feedback, we want to ramp up that stimulus. We want to enhance it. We want to amplify it. We want to make it stronger. So think of it kind of like a snowball effect. So it may exhibit a cascade or amplifying effect. So we're having or causing the variable to continue in the same direction as the initial change. So positive feedback is a bit more rare than negative feedback because usually if something is wrong with our homeostasis, we want to restore it. We don't want to make it worse. So one common example is enhancement of labor contractions by oxytocin. So that's a hormone. So once this process starts and the contractions begin, you don't want to turn them off. You want them to ramp up and get more intense and stronger in their contractions to help push the baby out. Another example is platelet plug formation in blood clotting. So when you cut yourself, you break a blood vessel, we initiate this positive feedback. So the platelets are going to start to stick to the damaged area and they're going to release chemicals. So these chemicals are going to attract more platelets to the area. So now these platelets are going to release chemicals that attract more platelets to the area and so on and so forth until we completely plug that break and stop the bleeding. So any disturbance of homeostasis or imbalance can increase the risk of disease. Can also be contributed to changes associated with aging. So just as we get older, things start to break down, and these feedback and control mechanisms just become less efficient. Um, Ultimately, if the negative feedback mechanisms become overwhelmed, so we're not able to fully restore homeostasis, then it may shift into a destructive positive feedback in cases like heart failure or progressive types of disease. So, looking at anatomical position and directional terms. So, when we study anatomy and physiology, it really is kind of like learning a whole new language. So, there's so many specific terms to learn. So, anatomical terms, directional terms used throughout anatomy and physiology courses. Um, so, starting off with anatomical position. So, anatomical position is when the body is erect, the feet are slightly apart, palms are facing forward, and the thumbs are pointing away from the body. So, this is kind of our standard base point of reference in all all terms of anatomy and physiology. So, directional terms work to describe body structure in relation to another body structure. And these directional terms are always based on our anatomical position. So again, it's kind of that standard base point of reference that we're always going to consider. Also, when using these terms, keep in mind that the right and left are referring to the subject, his right and left, not your right and left as the observer. So this would be the right hand and the left hand. So looking at some of these orientation and directional terms, so you'll see pretty much all of these come in pairs, right? They go in opposite directions. So the first one we'll look at is superior, sometimes called cranial. They're interchangeable, but this is just going toward the head or above another body part. Right? So we could say the head is superior to the abdomen. Right? Inferior then would be the opposite, right? So it's going to be away from the head, right, or below another body part. Inferior is also sometimes referred to as caudal. It just means tail, so toward the tail end. So we could say the navel, the belly button, is inferior to the chin, right? So it's below the chin. Anterior, sometimes referred to as ventral, means toward the front of the body or in front of something else. So we can say the breastbone is anterior to the spine, right? So it's in front of the spine. Posterior, sometimes referred to as dorsal, means toward the back of the body or behind something else. So we could say the heart is posterior to the breastbone. So the heart is behind the breastbone. So medial means toward the midline of the body. So it's on the inside of something else. So we could say the heart is medial to the arm. Right? So it's on the inside or closer to the middle of the body. Lateral would be the opposite. So it's going away from the center line of the body. So it's on the outside of something else. So the arms are lateral to the chest. Intermediate, we don't really use this one that much, but it's kind of just intermediate between medial and lateral. So it's more medial, more lateral structure. So we could say the collarbone is intermediate between the breastbone and the shoulder. So we could say it's kind of in between those two. Proximal is something that's closer to the point of origin of a body part, specifically a limb. So proximal and distal are only used when we're talking about the arms and the legs. So point of origin means where it attaches to the body, so either the shoulder or the hip. So if it's proximal, right, is closer to the shoulder, closer to the hip. So we could say the elbow is proximal to the wrist, right? So it's higher up the arm, closer to the shoulder. Distal, being the opposite, would be farther from that point of origin. So the knee is distal to the thigh. Sometimes it's easy to get proximal and distal confused with superior and inferior. So we could say the knee is superior to the ankle, and you technically wouldn't be wrong, but to be more correct, right, it would be the knee is proximal to the ankle. So to show that we're referring to a limb specifically. Superficial just means toward the body surface, so on the surface or above something. So the skin is superficial to the muscles, so it's on the outside of the muscles. Whereas deep would be away from the surface and more internal. So the lungs are deep to the skin, so they're going to be underneath the skin. Looking at regional terms, so there's two major divisions of the body. So we have the axial skeleton, which is kind of the axis or the center line of the body. So the head, the neck, and the trunk is the axial skeleton. The appendicular skeleton are your appendages, right? So the arms and the legs. Regional terms are used to designate specific areas within different body divisions. So pretty much every area of the body has its own special name. So we can pinpoint and be precise when we're referring to different body regions. Body planes and sections. So a body plane is just a surface where we may cut a subject for study. So basically different directions that you could chop somebody up in. So the three most common planes that we deal with in anatomy and physiology are the sagittal plane, which cuts down the middle or makes left and right halves, a frontal or a coronal plane, and a transverse or horizontal plane. So these sections are the cuts that result from cuts along these body planes. So a sagittal cut would result in a sagittal section. So looking at a sagittal section, right, so if we were to cut the body in half this way, right, you would see from a side view from this angle. Right? So if the body is cut in directly down the middle, it's called a mid-sagittal plane, but we can have sections that are off-center, so those would just be called a parasagittal plane. In a frontal plane, right, so we're going to make a anterior front section and a posterior back section. So sometimes called a coronal plane, so like a crown is going to go down the front of the body. And then a transverse plane, sometimes called a horizontal plane, is going to divide the body into superior and inferior section. So the body contains several internal cavities that are closed off to the external environment. And these cavities are going to provide protection to the organs within them. So we have two major body cavities, the dorsal body cavity containing the brain and the spinal cords and the dorsal or posterior region of the body, and the ventral body cavity, so in the anterior portion of the body, containing the lungs, the abdominal organs, the heart, and the pelvic organs. So the dorsal body cavity's function is to protect the nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. So it's divided into the cranial cavity that's going to encase the brain and the vertebral cavity that encases the spinal cord. The ventral body cavity is going to house the internal organs, sometimes referred to as the viscera. So there's two main subdivisions of the ventral body cavity, and they're separated by the diaphragm. So this is kind of the dividing line between these two cavities. The thoracic cavity is in the chest region, so it's going to contain the pleural cavities with each lung. Right, so each lung has its own cavity. The mediastinum, right, is going to contain the pericardial cavity and the heart. The abdominal pelvic cavity contains the abdominal cavity with the digestive organs, accessory organs, and then the pelvic cavity just below with the urinary and reproductive organs. The membranes in the ventral body cavity are sometimes called serosa, or a serous membrane. So it's just a thin, very thin, double-layered membrane that's going to cover the surfaces in that body cavity. So these two layers have different names. The outermost layer is called the parietal, so it's going to line the cavity wall itself. The visceral layer is going to cover the actual surface of the organ. So a good analogy to think about these serous membranes. Imagine you had a balloon. You have a balloon, you aired it up, and you put your fist or your hand into the balloon. So the outer balloon wall is comparable to the parietal pericardium or the parietal serosa. The inner balloon wall that's clinging tightly to the surface of your hand is representative of the visceral serosa, that's covering the actual surface of the organ. So these double layers are separated by a small cavity, and it's filled with a serous fluid. So the serous fluid is going to help lubricate and insulate and protect these organs. So some other serous membranes in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So the peritoneum is the serous membrane of the abdominal cavity with all the digestive organs. The pericardium is the body cavity containing the heart. And the pleural cavities contain the lungs. So you have the parietal and visceral pleura, parietal and visceral pericardium, and parietal and visceral peritoneum. So sometimes when we're looking at the body, we can divide this abdominal pelvic cavity into quadrants, right, just to kind of isolate and break down which particular organ may be causing the problem. So sectioned into quarters, the right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, left lower quadrant. So if you have a patient come in that complains of right upper quadrant pain, then we know maybe it's the gallbladder, it could be liver. Whereas if it's in the right lower quadrant, then we need to look for if it's the appendix. Left upper quadrant, right, would tell us that something's going on with the stomach. We can also divide the abdominopelvic cavity even further into 9 abdominopelvic regions. So this would be as if we put like a tic-tac-toe grid across the abdominopelvic cavity, just to kind of narrow down further which organ is in which specific region.